I'm Marin Milton, 47, and I've spent the last 9 years quietly commanding a Marine task element that runs the kind of missions nobody ever reads about. For 2 decades, my own family called me a paper pusher, a Marine with a fancy badge, and I let them, because the work only stays safe if you let people believe the boring version. But when a young Marine planted himself in front of me in the lobby of Headquarters Marine Corps and shouted at me to get out, I learned exactly what a lifetime of being underestimated had taught me to do. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who decided who you were before they knew a single thing about you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in your own worth while a room refused to see it, hit that like button and subscribe. The first time my father stopped timing me, I was 15 years old, sitting at our kitchen table in the gray light of a Virginia morning with the pieces of his old rifle spread across a dish towel in front of me. He used to time everything I did with that rifle. Field strip, clean, reassemble. He would click the stopwatch the second my hands moved and click it again when the last pin slid home. And then he would read the number out loud, in a flat voice that gave nothing away. That morning he did not click the watch at all. He just watched me work, and when I finished and looked up, he gave me a single nod and went back to his coffee. I did not understand until years later that the silence was the highest grade he had ever given me. My brother Theo was 12 that year, and he could not have found the firing pin if you had drawn him a map. That was never a problem for Theo, because nobody ever expected him to. He was loud and warm and easy to like, the kind of boy who filled a room without trying, and the whole family had quietly decided that if anyone in the next generation was going to wear the uniform, it would be him. My father had served in Vietnam. He did not talk about it, and the not talking was its own kind of weather in our house, a pressure you felt without ever seeing the front move through. He had this idea, never spoken, that the Corps was a thing that happened to sons. So when I started reading the recruiting pamphlets I had taken from the shelf at the library, I did it in my room with the door closed. We had a dinner that spring where my mother brought up the future the way she liked to, as if she were arranging flowers. She talked about Theo and the Corps, about how he had the build for it, the personality for it. When I said I had been looking into something called NROTC, she smiled at me, the way you smile at a child who has announced they want to be an astronaut and a veterinarian on the same afternoon. She told me the Corps was hard on women. She suggested gently that there were good careers on the administrative side, something with regular hours, something I could do and still have a life. My father said nothing. He buttered his bread and he said nothing, and I learned that night that in our family, silence could mean a great many things and you had to know a person down to the bone to tell them apart. I was 18 when I left for college in the officer track. My father drove me. He was not a man who talked in cars, so we listened to a baseball game on a station that kept dissolving into static the farther we got from home, and when he pulled up to the curb, he put the truck in park and reached into his jacket and handed me a folded piece of paper. He told me not to read it in front of him. Then he carried my bags to the curb, gripped my shoulder once, hard, and drove away before I had finished saying goodbye. I read the note 200 miles later at a rest stop with a vending machine that ate my last quarter. 4 words in his blocky engineer's hand. "Finish the job, Marine." He had called me Marine. I had not earned a single thing yet, not a bar, not a title, not a day of service, and my father had already promoted me in the only ceremony that ever mattered to me, performed in a parking lot, witnessed by no one. I kept that note in my wallet for 29 years. It is still there. There was a winter when I was 16, the year after the rifle on the dish towel, when a storm came through and knocked the power out for 3 days. The neighbors panicked, people drove to the store and fought over batteries and bottled water and came home angry. My father did none of that. He went out to the garage, came back with a kerosene heater he had kept serviced for exactly this, set it up in the front room, and then he taught me how to bleed the line and trim the wick and check the flames so it burned clean and not orange. Theo wanted to help and lost interest in about 4 minutes and went to find a flashlight to read by. I stayed. I always stayed. My father and I sat in the small circle of heat that first night, and he told me, in the longest stretch of words I think I ever got from him at once, that the people who do well in a crisis are almost never the loud ones. The loud ones spend their energy being loud, he said. The quiet ones spend it getting ready. He said most people go their whole lives never finding out which kind they are, because the test only comes when the lights go out, and by then it is too late to become someone new. You find out who you already are." He looked at me across that little flame and he said, "I already know which kind you are. I have known since you were small." And then he went quiet again for the rest of the night, the way he did. And I sat in the heat he had built, and I felt, for the first time in my life, completely and exactly seen. My mother loved me. I want to be fair to her because this is not the kind of story where anyone is a villain, and she was not one. She loved me the way you love a thing you do not understand, carefully, from a small distance, with a worry that came out sideways as advice. She wanted me safe. To her, the Corps was not a calling, it was a danger she could not talk me out of. And so she made it small in conversation, made it administrative, made it something with regular hours, because a daughter with a desk job was a daughter she did not have to lie awake about. I understand that now, in a way, I could not at 16. But understanding why a person cannot see you does not make the not being seen hurt any less. It just gives the hurt better manners. People who meet me now see a colonel. They see the rank and the bearing, and they make assumptions, and most of those assumptions are wrong, because the truth of a career like mine lives in the places you are not allowed to describe. But before any of that, before the things I cannot tell you, there was a girl at a kitchen table whose own family could not quite see her, learning the most important lesson of her life from a man who refused to say it out loud. You do not have to be loud to be the most dangerous person in the room. Sometimes the quiet ones are the only ones who actually finish the job. He told me that once, exactly once. And then he spent the rest of his life proving he meant it by the way he looked at me. I spent the rest of mine proving I had heard him. I want you to hold on to that girl because you are going to need her later. You are going to need to remember that long before there was a marble lobby and a young Marine who told me to get out of it. Long before a general crossed a room and did something 3 stars are not supposed to do. There was a 15-year-old with rifle parts on a dish towel and a father who stopped the clock. Everything that happened in that lobby happened because of her. She just did not know it yet. The years after I left home moved the way water moves through a canyon, slow in some places and impossibly fast in others. I was commissioned as second lieutenant the spring I turned 22. I made first lieutenant 2 years after that, and captain at 26, and somewhere in there I deployed for the first time and came back changed in ways I could not explain at Thanksgiving. The family I returned to was the family I had left. Theo had not joined the Corps after all. He had gone into sales, regional then national, and he was good at it, and the easy charm that filled a room as a boy filled conference centers now. He was happy. I was glad he was happy. But the story our family told about the two of us never updated. Theo was the interesting one. I was the one with the steady government job, the one whose work could be summarized in a sentence and dismissed in half of one. I let it stand. That is the part that takes the longest to explain to people who have never done the work I do. The cover only holds if you let people believe the boring version. The whole point is to be forgettable, to be the woman in the unremarkable office whom nobody photographs and nobody quotes. I was good at being forgettable. I had been practicing since I was a girl at a dinner table, watching attention flow past me toward my brother like a river going around a stone. What I never expected, what I could not have braced for, was that the people I was protecting would never know my name, and the people who raised me would forget I had one worth knowing. I told myself it did not matter. For a long time, I almost believed it. Theo had a way of summing me up at family gatherings that always got a laugh. He would wait for the lull, the moment after someone asked what I was up to these days, and he would lean back and say it with that grin of his. My sister, the Marine. She does paperwork. Important paperwork, sure, but nobody's making a movie about a stapler. The table would laugh and I would smile. And somewhere a few thousand miles away, there were men alive because of a decision I had signed my name to the week before, and I could not say a word about any of it. I would just reach for the rolls and pass them down and let my brother have the room, the way I always had. There was one Thanksgiving, the year I made captain, when I came home 4 days after returning from a deployment I could not describe. I had not slept properly in a month. There was a place behind my eyes that the desert had put there and would not leave for weeks. I sat at the table, and my hands were steady because I had trained them to be steady, and my mother asked me brightly whether I had gotten much sun on my trip, the way you would ask someone back from a beach. I said I had. Theo asked if the food was good wherever I had been, and I said it was fine, and he made a joke about military rations and government cheese. and the table laughed, and I laughed with them, because the alternative was to say something true, and the true thing would have emptied the room. I had carried a young lance corporal's gear out of a building 2 weeks before because he could no longer carry it himself, and I could not say that, and so I passed the cranberry sauce and asked Theo about his quarter. That is the cost nobody tells you about when you take this kind of work. It is not the danger. The danger is honest, at least. It is the dinners. It is sitting at the table you grew up at, among the people who made you, carrying something enormous and invisible, and reaching for the rolls. I would learn, years later, that the people who carry the same kind of weight recognize it in each other without a word. They do not need the story. They can read it in the set of your jaw at a dinner table, in the half-second too long that you hold a coffee cup, in the way your eyes go to the exits in a room that has no danger in it. I did not have anyone like that yet, that Thanksgiving. I would, but at the time I carried it alone, and I told myself that alone was simply the price, and I reached for the rolls and I passed them down. The strange thing about being underestimated for long enough is that it stops feeling like an insult and starts feeling like a uniform you forgot you were wearing. You move through the world invisible, and the invisibility becomes a kind of armor, until one ordinary morning in a marble lobby, a stranger looks at you and sees exactly what your own family always saw. And the armor turns out to be the thinnest thing you own. By the time I was 32, I was a major, and I had a deployment behind me that I marked on no calendar and described to no one. I came home for Thanksgiving that year because my father asked me to, and my father did not ask for things, so I went. I sat at the same table where my mother had once arranged the future like flowers, and I watched her arrange it again, and this time it was Theo's promotion to regional director that got the toast. I had pinned on the gold oak leaf of a major 6 weeks earlier. I mentioned it once, quietly. The way you set a glass down so as not to make a sound, my mother said how nice, and turned to ask Theo about his new territory. My father caught my eye across the table. He did not say congratulations. He did something better. He raised his water glass an inch off the tablecloth. Just for me, just for a second, and set it back down. Nobody else saw it. I have been toasted in rooms full of admirals and generals since then, in halls with my name on the program and a band playing, and I have never been toasted better than I was that night by a 70-year-old man with a water glass and a secret. I made lieutenant colonel at 37. I told my father on the phone, and there was a long pause on the line. And then he said the thing he always said, the thing that meant more than any other words in the language coming from him. I don't need to know what it is. I know what you are. He was getting older by then. His voice had thinned, but the certainty in it had not moved an inch since the kitchen table, since the rest stop, since the water glass. He had decided who I was when I was 15, and the world had spent decades catching up to a verdict he reached before I could legally drive. A year later, I was handed something new. I cannot tell you what it was called or what it did. I can tell you it was the work I had spent my whole life walking toward. And that when I took command of it, I understood for the first time why my father had stopped timing me all those years ago. Some jobs you do not measure by the clock. You measure them by who comes home. I had a senior enlisted Marine in that outfit, a master sergeant named Elena Reyes, who had been doing the work longer than I had and who saw straight through every wall I had ever built. She watched me take that first holiday call in the new command, watched my face while my mother put Theo on the line to tell me about his bonus, and when I hung up, she handed me a cup of coffee and said the truest thing anyone had said to me in years. Ma'am, the people who matter know exactly who you are. The rest is just noise you don't have to answer. I held on to that. I held on to it through the years that followed, through the long nights and the calls I made and the names I learned and could never repeat. I held on to it right up until a Tuesday morning at Headquarters Marine Corps, when a young sergeant who had never heard of me decided I did not belong in his lobby. And I discovered that some noise is harder not to answer than you think. I had been awake for 22 hours when I walked through the doors at Headquarters Marine Corps that morning. A red eye across the country, a rental car, traffic, and almost no sleep in the 2 days before, because the handover I was flying in to take had 100 loose threads I had been tying off by phone. I was in civilian clothes, travel clothes, a sweater and slacks that had spent the night folded in a seat back pocket, with my bag over one shoulder and my orders zipped inside it. I had not asked for the ceremony that was waiting upstairs. I had argued against it, in fact, because the work I do is the kind you do not throw a party for. But the new command was a joint task unit with a public face, and the Corps had decided the change of command would be done properly, in the open, and what the Corps decides a colonel does not get to veto. So I stood in that lobby, tired and rumpled, and I looked, I am sure, like exactly what the sergeant decided I was. A lost civilian. Somebody's aunt who had taken a wrong turn looking for a visitor's center. I was waiting for the duty officer to come down and escort me up, the way the protocol required, and I was content to wait, because waiting quietly is a thing I have done my entire life, and I am very good at it. The sergeant was young, maybe 26, squared away in his uniform, the kind of Marine who has just enough rank to feel responsible for the world, and not quite enough experience to know what is actually his to manage. He was there on his own errand, I learned later, waiting on something himself. But he saw me standing near the desk in my travel clothes, and he made a decision about me, and once he made it, he could not let it go. "Ma'am," he said, crossing toward me, "you can't be in here. This lobby is for active personnel only." I told him calmly that I was waiting on the duty officer. It was the right answer, and it changed nothing, because he had already decided. He stepped in front of me, closer than he needed to be, and his voice came up loud enough that the handful of people in the lobby turned to look. "Get out of here, lady," he said. "Are you deaf?" I said, "Leave." I had a sealed set of orders in the bag on my shoulder that would have ended the conversation in 3 seconds. I had a phone in my pocket with numbers in it that could have filled that lobby with very serious people very quickly. I did not reach for either one. I looked at this young Marine who had decided who I was without a single fact, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was not anger. It was recognition. I had been looked at that way my entire life. I knew the shape of it, the way you know your own reflection. So I did the thing my father taught me at a kitchen table 32 years before. I stayed quiet, and I stayed still, and I said only one thing. "Sergeant," I said, "I'd ask you to call your duty officer before you say another word." He did not get the chance. Behind him, the heavy glass doors at the front of the lobby swung open, and Lieutenant General Harlan Voss walked in with his aide a half step behind him. 3 stars on each collar. 58 years old and built like a man who still ran the obstacle course to prove a point. He took 2 steps into that lobby, and he saw me standing there in my travel clothes with a young sergeant in my face, and he stopped cold. And then he did the thing that 3-star generals do not do. He came to attention, and he raised his hand, and he saluted me first. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that marble room. "The commandant has been waiting on you. I want you to understand what that did to the air in that lobby." A lieutenant general does not salute a colonel first. It is not how the math of the Corps works. The junior renders the salute, the senior returns it, and everyone in uniform learns that on the first day and never unlearns it. So when a 3-star crossed a marble floor and saluted a rumpled woman in a sweater, before she had said a word to him, every Marine in that lobby went absolutely still, because they had just watched the rules bend, and the only thing that bends the rules like that is rank you cannot see or a debt you cannot measure. The sergeant turned around. He saw the stars. The color went out of his face the way water goes out of a tipped glass, all at once, leaving nothing behind. General Voss did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked at the young man, and then he looked at me, and he said the words, quietly, almost kindly, which somehow made them land harder than any reprimand could have. "Sergeant," he said, "this is Colonel Milton. She's the one who got your team out of that valley." The young Marine's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment, and when it finally did, it came out as barely more than a breath. "Ma'am," he said, I didn't know. "I know you didn't," I said, and I let it sit there, because the silence was already doing all the work, and there was nothing I could add that would do it better. He could not lift his eyes off the floor. The whole lobby had gone so quiet I could hear the doors hiss shut behind the general, and a young sergeant stood in the middle of all of it, unable to look at the woman he had just tried to throw into the street. The duty officer arrived a moment later, breathless, apologizing, and General Voss waved the apology away with the ease of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything. He told the duty officer he would escort me up himself, and he turned and gestured toward the elevators, and just like that, the lobby released its held breath and went back to being a lobby. People found somewhere else to look. The sergeant stepped aside. I did not look at him as I passed, not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing to give him in that moment that would not have made it worse. And I have never believed in stepping on a man who was already on the floor. Master Sergeant Reyes was waiting for me by the elevators. She had flown in for the ceremony, and she had seen the whole thing from across the lobby, every second of it, and the look on her face was the particular flat fury of a senior enlisted Marine watching a junior one make a fool of himself. We stepped into the elevator together, and the doors closed, and for the first time in 22 hours, I let my shoulders down. "You could have ended that boy with one sentence," she said. "You didn't even raise your voice." "He's somebody's Marine, Elena," I said. "Embarrassing him doesn't make me taller." She did not answer that, but she gave a small grunt that I had learned over the years meant she disagreed with my method and approved of me anyway. The elevator climbed. I watched the numbers change, and I thought, the way you cannot help thinking when something cracks the surface, about the valley. It had been 3 years. The details of it are mostly things I cannot give you, but the shape of it I can. There was a squad pinned down in terrain that should not have been crossed in the first place, in the last hour of daylight, with weather closing, and a higher command that had looked at the same picture I was looking at, and decided the smart play was to wait. Wait for morning. Wait for the weather to lift. Wait for better light and better odds. On paper, it was the careful call, and on paper, I understood it. But I was not looking at paper. I was looking at a clock, and I knew something the paper did not, which was that those Marines did not have until morning. They had about 40 minutes. Daylight was 4 hours away. I made the call to send the element in early. It was against the guidance. It was my authority to make and my name on the order. And if it had gone wrong, it would have been my career and worse, the lives of the people I sent. It did not go wrong. They went in, and they came out, and they brought the squad with them, every one of them, in the dark and the weather that command had wanted to wait out. I have signed my name to a great many decisions in this job. Some of them I would take back if I could. That one I would sign again with my eyes closed, in any weather, in any light. I remember the radio that night more than anything else. You do not get to be in the valley when you make a call like that. You are in a room far away, with screens and maps and voices, and the war comes to you as sound, stripped of everything except the words and the breathing behind them. I remember a voice on the ground, very young, very calm in the way that only terror makes a person calm, reporting his situation in clipped pieces, and I remember the silence between his transmissions, which were the longest silences of my life. I remember the staff officer beside me reading me the guidance one more time, the careful guidance, the wait for daylight guidance, and I remember looking at the clock and doing the only math that mattered. And I remember the exact moment I stopped being a person who follows the careful guidance and became a person who would answer for whatever came next. I gave the order. My voice did not shake, because I had spent 30 years training it not to, since a kitchen table, since a stopwatch that stopped. The element went in. For 19 minutes, I did not breathe in any way I would call breathing. And then the young voice came back on the radio, and it said the words, "You spend a whole career waiting to hear, all accounted for, all coming home," and I put my hand flat on the table to keep it still, and I said, "Copy, good work," in a voice like I was confirming a lunch order, because that is the job, and then I went into a stairwell where no one could see me, and I stood there for a while by myself. The names came across the radio that night, every one of them, and I wrote them down, and I kept the list the way I keep my father's note. I never met those Marines. That is how it almost always goes. You make the call and the names come across, and then they go back to their lives and you go back to yours, and the two of you never cross paths again, and that is exactly how it is supposed to work. You are not supposed to meet them. You are certainly not supposed to meet one of them 3 years later in a marble lobby, watching the color drain out of his face as a general tells him whose hands carried him out of the dark. I did not know, until General Voss said it in that lobby, that the young sergeant with his finger in my face had been one of the Marines on that ground. I had never seen his face. The people I pull out of the dark are rarely the people I ever meet. That is the nature of it. You make the call, and the names come across the radio, and then they go back to their lives, and you go back to yours, and the two of you never cross paths again. Except that sometimes, 3 years later, on a Tuesday morning, in a marble lobby, the math comes around, and a man you saved tells you to get out of his building, and a general has to be the one to tell him whose hands carried him home. Down in the lobby, after I had gone up, Sergeant Dax Wyatt stood where I had left him for a long moment. I know this because Reyes went back down to retrieve something and watched it happen. He went to a gunnery sergeant he knew and he asked, in a voice that was not steady, who that colonel had been. The gunny told him the name, told him the unit as much as anyone says it out loud, told him the piece of it that had become a quiet legend in certain circles, the night call in the valley that brought 11 Marines out of a place they were supposed to die in. And Reyes said she watched the young man's face as the pieces came together, and she said it was not a thing she enjoyed watching, even angry as she was, because there is no harder mirror in the world than the one that shows you the face of the person you wronged and tells you they are the reason you are alive to do the wronging. Upstairs, they put me in a quiet office to wait, with a cup of coffee and the program for the ceremony on the desk. I picked it up. There was my name, printed in the careful font the Corps uses for these things, Colonel Marin Milton, incoming commander. I sat with it in my hands and I felt the strangeness that always comes at these moments, the hollowness underneath the honor. Because the people in that hall would stand and clap for a story they had only just been told, and the people who had raised me, the people whose table I'd grown up at, would never understand the half of it. My mother would ask if the ceremony had been nice, my brother would ask if I finally had an office with a window, and somewhere out there were 11 Marines and their families who would never know my name, and a 12th who now knew it and wished he did not. I thought about my father, 78 now, who was making the trip to be there. He had known what I was since I was 15. He did not need a program with my name on it, but I wanted him in that room anyway, and I could not have told you exactly why, except that there is a part of every child, no matter how old, that wants to be seen finishing the job by the one person who first called them by the title. Reyes came back up and found me with the program still in my hands. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she pulled a chair around and sat across from me the way she had 100 times in 100 worse rooms than this one, and she said, "You're allowed to enjoy it, you know. Just this once." "You're allowed." "I'm enjoying the coffee," I said. She laughed at that, and the laugh did more for me than the coffee did. Two people who had carried things together, sitting in a quiet office while a hall filled up downstairs, both of us turning over the same 30 seconds in the lobby and the same 3 years in our memories, both of us understanding that the floor we were standing on had been laid a long time ago, in the dark, in a valley, by a decision nobody clapped for at the time. The thing about a moment like the lobby is that it does not stay in the lobby. By the time I had finished the coffee, word of it had gone up and down the building the way these things do, faster than any official channel. The story of the colonel in the sweater and the sergeant who told her to leave, and the 3-star who saluted her first. I did not want it to spread, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And somewhere in the middle of that, I realized that the young sergeant's worst day was very likely just beginning, and that I was going to have to decide what kind of person I wanted to be about it. There was a knock, and General Voss put his head in. He had taken off the formality with the elevator ride, and what was left was a man I had known by reputation for years and met in person only twice. He sat down across from me, waved Reyes back into her chair when she started to rise, and got straight to it the way good generals do. "That sergeant," he said. "Wyatt. You want him counseled, it's done. You want more than counseled, that's done too. Say the word, and it never reaches you again." I thought about it. I want to be honest with you, because the easy version of this story is the one where I am gracious without a flicker of temptation, and that is not the true version. For about 3 seconds, I thought about how satisfying it would be to let the machine do what the machine does to a sergeant who shouts at a colonel in the lobby of Headquarters Marine Corps. 3 seconds. Then I thought about a 15-year-old at a kitchen table and a man who stopped a clock instead of grinding her down, and I knew which person I wanted to be, because I had been raised by the other kind of strength, the kind that does not need to win to know it is winning. "No paperwork, General," I said. "But I'd like 5 minutes with him before I leave. Not as a colonel, just 5 minutes. Voss looked at me for a moment, and something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when you have confirmed a thing he hoped was true. He said he would arrange it. He stood, and at the door, he paused and said one more thing, almost to himself. 26 years I've been doing this," he said. "You can always tell the ones who never needed the rank to be who they are." He tapped the door frame once, the way my father used to, and he was gone. Reyes waited until the door closed. Then she looked at me and said, 5 minutes. "You're going to give that boy 5 minutes. I'm going to give that boy 5 minutes," I said. She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling when she did it, and I knew that somewhere under the disapproval she had wanted me to say exactly that because she had been raised by the same kind of strength I had, in a different house, by different people, who had taught her the same impossible lesson. The truth does not need to shout. It just needs you to hold your ground long enough for the room to catch up. My brother arrived an hour before the ceremony. Theo had flown in too because my mother had insisted the family be represented, and my mother gets what she insists on. He found me in the corridor outside the hall, and he was exactly as I remembered him, easy and grinning, a man comfortable in any room because he had never once been made to feel he did not belong in one. He hugged me, and he held me at arm's length and looked at the lanyard and the visitor badge they had given me, and he said the thing he always said, in the voice he always said it in. So they finally give you a real office with a window, or you still working in the broom closet with the good parking? A year before, a month before, I would have smiled and let it go, the way I had let it go 1,000 times. But I had been awake for 23 hours, and I had stood in a lobby that morning and been told to get out of it, and something in me had quietly run out of the patience it takes to perform smallness for the comfort of other people. I did not snap at him. I want to be clear about that. I just stopped playing my part. "I'm tired, Theo," I said, "and I stopped needing you to think I'm impressive a long time ago." He blinked. The grin held for a second out of pure habit, and then it slipped, because in 44 years of knowing me, he had never heard me say anything like that. "You're being weird," he said. "Where's the comeback? You always have a comeback." "I don't have one today," I said, and I left it there, and I watched my brother stand in a marble corridor and feel, for the first time in his life, the ground move under a story he had been telling so long he had mistaken it for the floor. Reyes appeared at my elbow before he could find his footing and told me, lo, that the word had reached the people whose job it is to care about appearances, and that some of them wanted the lobby incident dealt with formally. An example made, a young sergeant put through the ringer so that nobody could say Headquarters Marine Corps let a colonel be disrespected in its own front hall. There were officers, well-meaning ones, who thought my dignity required a sacrifice and who were prepared to offer up Sergeant Wyatt to it. I told them no. I told them, through Reyes and then directly to the two who pressed it, that my dignity was not a thing that needed defending by ending a young man's career, and that I would take it as a personal discourtesy if anyone turned the morning into a disciplinary spectacle in my name. Dignity that has to be protected by punishing other people, I have always thought, is not dignity. It is vanity wearing dignity's coat. I had spent my whole life being underestimated, and I had learned the difference between the two from the inside, and I was not about to confuse them now that the room had finally turned my way. What I did not see, because I was occupied with all of this, was what was happening to Theo, alone in the hall, finding a folding chair near the back and sitting in it with the strange new weight he had picked up in the corridor. An officer settled into the chair beside him, an older colonel making conversation the way people do before a ceremony, and the two of them got to talking, and the officer asked Theo if he knew the incoming commander. "She's my sister," Theo said. And the officer, not knowing, not connecting the quiet woman in the program to the man's idea of his sister, said something that Theo told me about much later, in a different voice than I had ever heard him use. The officer said, "You know the story about her, right? The Valley. Command wanted to wait for daylight. She didn't. Whoever made that call saved 11 Marines. People still talk about it." "Your sister," the officer said, shaking his head with the kind of respect you cannot fake. "Hell of a thing." My brother had spent 20 years certain he was the interesting one. He found out otherwise from a stranger in a folding chair 10 minutes before they called my name. I learned all of that afterward. At the time, I was being walked through the last details before the ceremony, and somewhere down the corridor, a young sergeant was living through the longest hour of his career. Reyes had eyes on him, the way she had eyes on everything, and she told me he had asked to wait outside the office where I would be, and that he had been standing there for the better part of an hour in his dress blues now, having gone somewhere to change because he could not bear to face me in the utilities he had worn when he told me to leave. He stood at parade rest against the wall and he waited, certain his career was over, and Reyes said she heard him say something under his breath. Not to her, not to anyone, just out loud to the empty corridor the way men do when a thing is too big to keep inside. "She's the reason I'm standing here," he said, and I told her to get out. There is no punishment the Corps could have handed that young man worse than the one he was handing himself. I knew that. I had known it from the moment the color left his face in the lobby. The machine could have taken his rank. It could not have touched the thing that was actually happening to him, which was the slow, total collapse of the easy certainty that he was one of the good ones, The realization that on an ordinary morning, with no enemy in sight and nothing on the line, he had looked at a tired woman in a sweater and decided she was nothing, and been wrong in the largest way a person can be wrong. That is the thing about how we treat the people we think are beneath us. It is never really about them. It is a test we do not know we are taking, administered on ordinary mornings when we think no one important is watching. And the grade comes back at the worst possible time, in the worst possible way. When the person we dismiss turns out to be the one who carried us out of the dark. The building, meanwhile, did what buildings full of Marines always do with a story like that one. It moved it faster than any official message ever travels. By mid-morning, I could feel it in the way people looked at me in the corridors, the careful, slightly odd glances of people who had heard the lobby story and the valley story stitched into one. And I did not enjoy it, because attention has always sat on me like a borrowed coat. I had spent my whole career being the woman nobody photographed, and the work had taught me that being unseen was not a wound. It was an advantage. It was the thing that kept the people I sent home alive. Now here I was, the most looked-at person in the building, and every instinct I owned wanted to find a quiet stairwell and wait it out. But you cannot duck a change of command, and you cannot unring the bell that a 3-star rings when he salutes you in your travel clothes in front of the morning crowd. So I let them look. I had held my ground through a great many harder things than admiration, and I held it through that too. What I kept thinking about, underneath all of it, was not the sergeant, and not the brother, and not the general. It was how close I had come, my whole life, to believing the small version of myself that everyone kept handing me. That is the real danger of being underestimated for decades. It is not what other people think. It is the slow temptation to agree with them, to make yourself smaller because smaller is what the room keeps reaching for, to mistake their failure of vision for a fact about you. I had not agreed. Something my father planted at a kitchen table had held the line in me through every dinner and every joke and every holiday phone call. And standing in that building, finally seen, I understood that the seeing was nice, but it had never been the thing that saved me. The thing that saved me was that I had refused, quietly, for 47 years, to disappear. When the time came, they brought him to the office, and Reyes stepped out, and for the first time since the lobby, Sergeant Dax Wyatt and I were in a room together with the door closed. He stood at attention so rigid I thought he might crack. I told him to stand easy, and he tried, and could not quite manage it. I did not sit behind the desk, because a desk is a kind of weapon, and I did not want one in the room. I leaned against the front of it, close to his level, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to understand I was not going to fill it for him. "Ma'am," he finally said, "I keep thinking about how I talked to you. After what you did." I did not let him stay there, because I did not bring him into that room to watch him drown. "You didn't know who I was," I said. "That's not the part that matters. Anybody can be decent to a colonel. The question that actually counts is who you are when you don't know who's watching, when the person in front of you is nobody, when there's nothing in it for you to be kind. That's the only test that means anything, Sergeant. And the good news is, you get to take it again every single day." He looked at me, then, really looked, and I saw the thing I had been hoping to see, which was not shame, but the harder, better thing underneath shame, which is the desire to be different. He asked me about my squad. I asked him about his, by their names, because I knew them, because you do not make a call like the one I made in that valley without learning every name on the ground. I said the names out loud. Something in him came apart a little when I did, in the way that men who have been holding something for 3 years come apart, quietly with their spines still straight. Then he asked me the question I had been waiting for, haltingly, like a man asking for something he was sure he had forfeited. "Ma'am," he said, "is there any way, someday, that I could serve under you?" I did not promise him anything. A promise would have been a gift, and gifts are not what build people. "Earn it," I said. "Same as everyone. Same as I did. There's no shortcut, and I wouldn't respect you if you wanted one. But the door isn't closed. You closed it this morning, and then you spent the last hour trying to open it again, and that tells me more about you than the lobby did. So, who are you going to be, Sergeant?" He came back to attention, and this time he held it clean, and he said, "The better one, ma'am." And I believed him, which is not a thing I say lightly, because believing people is the most expensive thing I do. I let him go. And as he reached the door, I said one more thing, because I am my father's daughter, and I have learned that the most important things should be said quietly and only once. You didn't owe me an apology for not knowing who I was, I said. You owed me one for deciding I was nothing before you found out. There's a difference. Carry it. Yes, ma'am, he said, and he was gone. Theo found me a few minutes later. My brother had been sitting in that folding chair with the stranger's words ringing in him, and he came down the corridor looking like a man who had set down something heavy and could not yet feel his arms. He started 3 sentences and abandoned all of them. Finally, he just said it. I called you a paper pusher, in front of people, for years. I made it a joke and everybody laughed, and I never once... He stopped. I never once asked you what you actually did. I just decided. I know, I said. Why didn't you ever correct me? He said. You could have shut me up any time. 1 sentence. Why did you let me? Because I couldn't tell you, I said. And because somewhere along the way, I think I started to believe that if I had to explain it, it didn't count. That was my mistake, not yours. But the deciding, Theo. The deciding I was small before you knew anything. That part was always a choice you were making, and you can make a different one starting now. He nodded. He did not try to fix 44 years in a corridor, which is the first wise thing I had seen my brother do in a long time. You can do better, I said. Start now. And he said he would, and for once I did not hear the easy charm in it. I heard a man who had just learned that the most interesting person at every dinner table he had ever sat at was the one he had been talking over. The hall was nearly full by the time they moved me into the wings. Through the gap in the curtain, I could see all of it. Sergeant Wyatt, off to one side now, standing straighter than he had stood all day. Theo in the audience, subdued, his hands folded, watching the stage instead of working the room for the first time in his life. And near the front, in a chair they had set out special, my father. He is 78 years old. He flew across the country to sit in a metal folding chair and watch them say out loud the thing he figured out when I was 15. He had his good jacket on, the one he wore to funerals and weddings and nothing in between, and his hands were folded over the head of the cane he pretends he does not need, and he was looking at the stage with an expression I had only ever seen on him a handful of times in my life. The expression of a man watching a job get finished. General Voss took the podium and began to speak about the new task unit, about the importance of the work, about the kind of officer it takes to lead it. He had not said my name yet. He was building to it the way you build to the thing that matters, and the hall had gone quiet and attentive. And in the wings, Rhea stood beside me with her cover under her arm. Whatever they say up there, ma'am, she said, low, it won't be the half of it. It never is, I said. That's the job. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that only Reyes would have known to say. Your dad came a long way, she said. You should look at him when they call it. Not the crowd. Him. The crowd will be there next time and the time after that. He won't always be. I told her I knew, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to because she had reached past all the rank and all the ceremony and put her finger on the only thing in that hall that could still undo me. A 78-year-old man in his funeral and wedding jacket, who had flown across a country on a body that did not want to make the trip, to sit in a metal chair and watch a verdict he reached 3 decades ago finally read into the record by someone other than himself. I had stood in front of generals without my pulse changing. The thought of my father in that chair was the only thing all day that made my hands want to shake. So I did what I had trained them to do my whole life. I held them still, and I told myself I would look at him, only him, when the moment came. She smiled. Down in the hall, my father's hand tightened on the head of his cane. Off to the side, a young sergeant in dress blues held his breath. And General Voss reached the end of the building and the beginning of the only part anyone would remember, and the whole room leaned in toward a name that had not been spoken yet. And I stood in the dark of the wings the way I have stood in the dark my whole life, waiting for the light, ready for it, finally, after all this time. It is a strange thing to hear your own name said correctly. Voss said it the way it deserved to be said, with the weight of the work behind it, and the hall came to its feet, and I walked out into the light to the sound of a room standing up. I have been in loud rooms before. This one was different, because for the first time the people standing were standing for the actual thing, not the cover story, not the boring version, the real one. Sergeant Wyatt's salute was the first thing I saw clearly. He had positioned himself where I would pass, and as I came level with him, he came to attention and rendered a salute so sharp and so certain that it was its own sentence, the one he could not finish in the lobby that morning. It was aimed at me the way it should have been aimed all along. I stopped and I returned it properly, the way the Corps teaches you on the first day, and you never unlearn. That was the whole apology, given and accepted in 2 motions and no words at all. It was enough. It was more than enough. And then I found my father across the room. He did not stand, because standing is hard for him now, and he did not salute, because he is a civilian 3 times over by the calendar, even if he will never be one in his bones. He just held my eyes across all those heads and all that noise, and he nodded once, slow, the way he nodded at a kitchen table 32 years ago when he stopped the clock. He did not need to say anything. He had said all of it already, 4 words in an engineer's hand at a rest stop when I was 18 and had earned nothing yet, and he had promoted me anyway. The whole world had finally caught up to a verdict he reached before I could drive. Finish the job, Marine. I had. He knew, and the knowing passed between us across that hall, silent, complete, the loudest quiet thing I have ever felt. Afterward, there were the small joys, the ones that taste better than the ceremony itself. Rhea's ribbing me about the sweater, telling me she was going to have it bronzed. Theo standing a little apart, learning the new and unfamiliar art of listening. Asking me an actual question about my work, and then, miracle of miracles, waiting for the answer. Wyatt finding me one last time to ask, formally and correctly, about the path forward, and getting an honest answer about how long and how hard it would be, and looking somehow glad of the difficulty. I want to say something to you now, whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this. If you have ever been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one they handed an apron or a joke or a wrong turn assumption instead of a chance, I want you to hear me, because I have lived your whole life from the inside. You do not owe anyone the loud version of your worth. You do not have to explain yourself to people who decided who you were before they knew anything. The truth does not need volume. It does not need a marble lobby or a general or a room standing up. Those things came in the end, but they were never the point. The point was that I knew who I was on the morning a stranger told me to get out, and I would have known it just the same if the general had never walked through that door. The truth just needs time. It needs you to hold your ground, quietly, the way a stone holds its ground while the river goes around it, year after year, certain of itself, in no hurry at all. And then one ordinary day the room catches up, and the people who could not see you finally do, and you discover that the recognition is sweet, but it was never the thing that kept you standing. The thing that kept you standing was you. It always was. I walked out of that hall into ordinary daylight, lighter than I came in, with my father's nod still warm in my chest, and a young Marine's salute still sharp in my memory, and a brother behind me learning to listen. And I thought about a 15-year-old at a kitchen table with rifle parts on a dish towel, and I told her, the way I wish someone had told me, that the clock she could not hear stopping was the sound of someone deciding she was already enough. She always was. So are you. Hold your ground. The light comes. It always, always comes. That morning in the lobby could have gone 100 ways, and I chose the one where I didn't have to make a young man smaller to feel tall. I keep coming back to that choice because I think it's the whole point of everything I've ever done in this uniform. Was I wrong to let Sergeant Wyatt walk away without a single mark on his record? Have you ever been the quiet one at the table, carrying something the people around you couldn't see? And if a stranger has ever decided you were nothing, what did you do at that moment? I'd really love to hear your answers in the comments, because I read them and they stay with me. If this story found a place in you, hit subscribe and sit with me a while. There's room for you here.